After our last video, you might be wondering, what exactly is the difference between a measure and a calculated column? This is an excellent question, and one that beginning Power BI developers inevitably find themselves asking. After all, don't they both use DAX to perform some calculation? How do we know when we should click the New Measure button instead of the New Column button, or vice versa? The answer is that it depends on the context in which the DAX calculation gets evaluated. This evaluation context is the key difference between measures and calculated columns. When we create a calculated column with DAX, we're creating a formula that gets evaluated for each row in a given table. The phrase "for each row" is what we should remember when distinguishing measures from calculated columns. It describes why calculated columns are so effective in working with date tables. We created a table with one row for each date, and then we used additional calculated columns to evaluate each row in that table and return the different parts of the date, like each date's year, quarter, month, and day. So we should use calculated columns when we want to evaluate the data for each row in a table, just like we did with our dates. On the other hand, when we create a measure using DAX, we're creating a formula that gets evaluated in the context in which it is used. Whatever context we decide to use, whether that's a table, a chart, a matrix, or a card, a measure will be calculated within that context. For example, if we create a matrix visual with years for each row and months for each column, and then drop a measure in there that averages our total expenses, the formula for that measure will be evaluated for each combination of year and month. If we use a slicer or another visual to slice and dice the data interactively, our computer's processor will recalculate the measure with every interaction. This is why measures are so incredibly fast and the preferred method for performing analysis in Power BI. These values are being calculated dynamically using our formula, and no additional data is being created or stored in our data model. The calculations are all happening in real time as we interact with the data. We should use measures when we want to aggregate our data, like summing, averaging, and so on. The other features that distinguish calculated columns are that they only get recalculated when you refresh your data model from its data source, and they actually store their output in your data model. If we add more transactions to the CSV file we're currently working with, we'll need to refresh our data model to import those new transactions so we can see them in our report. When we do that, our date table will be recalculated to see if it needs to add more rows. If it adds more rows during the refresh, our calculated columns will also recalculate to add the year, quarter, month, and day for each row in our table. And all this data that is returned by our calculations will be physically stored in the data model in our Power BI report. As a result, our calculated table becomes an indelible part of our data model, to the point where we can even create relationships between the calculated table and the other tables in our model that are not calculated, just like we did in this week's first video. Calculated columns depend on tables by their very nature because they are evaluated in the context of each row for that table. Measures are not bound by the same context limitations, so they technically exist independent of tables. When we create a measure, it gets attached to a table in our model, but this is really just for the sake of organization. Remember how we created GDP and population measures for our country data? Some developers might prefer to keep those measures attached to the indicators table, since that's the table we use to calculate them. But we don't actually need to do that. We can move our measures between tables in Power BI, and it will not affect the calculation of those measures in any way. To see this, simply select a measure from the Fields pane in any of the reports we've created so far, and then go to the Measure Tools tab and look for a setting called Home Table. It includes a drop-down list that shows all the tables in your data model, and you can move your measures between different tables. When you do this, the results of the calculation will not change. In one of our later videos, we'll use the Home Table feature with our measures to create a metrics table, which is just an empty table in our data model. And then we'll move all our measures into that table. This is a common trick that Power BI developers use to keep our measures well organized, particularly in larger reports when we have many different measures to keep track of. So, to sum up, here are the key differences between measures and calculated columns. Remember that measures evaluate in the context in which they're used, while calculated columns are evaluated in the context of each row in the table. Meanwhile, measures are calculated dynamically as we use the report, while calculated columns are only calculated when the data model is refreshed. Finally, measures don't store any data, but calculated columns actually store data in the data model. Finally, measures can be attached to any table in the data model, but calculated columns are bound to a specific table.